Imagine being told you can't own anything, can't speak in public, and can't even choose what to wear, all because you're a woman. Welcome to medieval Europe, where men made all the rules, broke most of them themselves, and still somehow thought they were the sensible ones. Spoiler alert, they weren't. Speaking of these power-hungry medieval men, medieval Europe wasn't just a boys' club, it was the original no girls allowed treehouse, except the treehouse was every castle, church, and position of power across an entire continent. While modern workplace discrimination might get you a strongly worded email from HR, medieval discrimination was literally written into law, enforced by armies, and blessed by the Pope himself. Let's talk about kings first. These guys wore fancy crowns, sat on thrones made of actual swords, and had absolute power over everyone's lives. Not a single queen ruled in her own right in medieval England until Mary the Fotis in 1553. And even then, people acted like the world was ending because a woman dared to sit on the throne. Many of these kings could barely read, while their wives and sisters often spoke multiple languages and managed entire royal households. But heaven forbid they touch the crown. It's like having a CEO who can't use email while the entire office is run by their assistant who speaks 5 languages and has 3 degrees. The lords weren't any better. These were basically medieval landlords, except instead of refusing to fix your leaky faucet, they controlled entire regions and could decide whether peasants lived or died. A fascinating stat. Records from the 13th century show that male nobles inherited property 98% of the time, even when they had older, smarter sisters. Imagine being passed over for a promotion because your younger brother knows how to burp the alphabet. That's basically what medieval noblewomen dealt with. And these lords weren't exactly picking up the slack. Many spent most of their time hunting, feasting, or starting petty wars while their wives secretly kept everything from falling apart. Knights, those supposedly chivalrous defenders of honor, were another piece of work. Sure, they wrote poetry about women's beauty and fought in tournaments wearing their ladies' favors, but it was all for show. In medieval tournaments, knights would often wear a piece of their ladies' clothing as a good luck charm, usually a sleeve or a veil. Nothing says true love like wearing your girlfriend's sleeve while trying to knock other guys off horses with a pointy stick. And let's not forget these same romantic knights had no problem enforcing laws that treated women like property. The real disappointment was the political system. Not a single woman could vote, though. To be fair, most men couldn't either, but women couldn't even attend town meetings in many places. There's this hilarious record from a French town in 1267 where a woman tried to speak at a public gathering, and the local officials were so scandalized they spent 3 days debating whether to exile her or just fine her family. They eventually decided on the fine because, get this, they worried exile would give her too much freedom to travel. Imagine being so threatened by a woman's opinion that you need a 3-day conference to decide how to punish her for having one. Speaking of travel, noblewomen were basically under house arrest. They could only leave their homes with permission from their male guardians and usually needed an escort. One clever noblewoman in the 14th century Yorkshire got around this by convincing her husband she needed to go on frequent pilgrimages. She actually used these religious journeys to manage her own secret trading business. When her husband finally caught on, he was so impressed by how much money she'd made that he pretended not to notice. Sometimes the best man for the job was definitely a woman. The church was especially good at keeping women down while pretending it was for their own good. Priests would preach about women's delicate nature and need for protection, while simultaneously claiming they were temptresses who could corrupt men's souls. Talk about mixed messages. It's like telling someone they're too weak to open a jar, but strong enough to apparently destroy civilization with their feminine wiles. These religious leaders would spend hours writing detailed rules about what women couldn't do, which makes you wonder if they had any actual hobbies. But the crazy part is, despite all these restrictions, some medieval women managed to gain serious power. They just had to be sneaky about it. Eleanor of Aquitaine practically ran England while her son, Richard the Lionheart, was off crusading, but officially she was just managing things until he got back. Christine de Pizan became one of medieval Europe's most famous writers by cleverly packaging her criticism of misogyny as advice for nobles, and Joan of Arc led armies by claiming God told her to do it, because apparently the only way men would take orders from a woman was if they thought the command came from heaven. For the average nobleman, the perfect wife was basically a medieval Stepford wife, beautiful, quiet, and completely obedient. But here's a fun fact. Medieval records show that the most successful noble families were often those where husbands actually listened to their wives' advice. Turns out, ignoring half your population's brain power isn't great for problem solving. Who knew? Speaking of decisions, you wouldn't believe how creative medieval legal systems got when it came to keeping women in their place. The rules were so twisted, they'd make a pretzel jealous. The legal system of medieval Europe should have been called rules for men, suggestions for when men feel like following them. You know how people say justice is blind? Well, medieval justice wasn't just blind, it was deaf, dumb, and definitely biased against anyone wearing a dress. If Lady Justice had been real back then, she probably would have peeked under her blindfold just to make sure she was ruling against the woman. Here's a real case from 1342 England. A woman named Agnes brought her husband to court for stealing her inheritance. The judge's response? He fined her for wasting the court's time because, according to him, a wife's property automatically belonged to her husband anyway. It's like complaining that someone stole your wallet only to be told that your wallet naturally belongs to the thief. Makes total sense, right? The court records show Agnes had to pay a fine of 40 shillings, about 6 months' wages for a skilled worker, for daring to question her husband's right to take everything she owned. The courts had this amazing talent for turning logic into a pretzel. Women couldn't testify in major court cases because they were considered unreliable witnesses. Yet somehow they were reliable enough to be punished for crimes. One poor woman in France was fined for giving false testimony before she even opened her mouth. The judge just assumed she would lie because, well, she was a woman. Talk about a rigged system. The only time women's testimony was fully trusted was when they were confessing to crimes. Funny how that worked. Legal records from the 1300s show some truly bizarre double standards. A man who beat his wife would get a stern talking to maybe, while a woman who raised her voice to her husband could be put in the stocks. There's this fascinating court record from 1389 where a man was acquitted of assault because his wife had provocatively burned his dinner. The judge's written opinion basically said, what else was he supposed to do? I don't know, maybe cook his own dinner. The same court fined a woman a week's wages for excessively sighing during her husband's lengthy explanation of why he needed more spending money. Marriage laws were particularly horrible. Once married, a woman legally ceased to exist as her own person. Everything she owned, earned, or inherited automatically belonged to her husband. There's this incredible case from 1356 where a merchant's widow tried to claim her own shop after his death. The court told her that since the business had been in her name during the marriage, it legally belonged to her husband's family, even though she'd run it alone for 20 years while he was off finding himself on various pilgrimages. She lost her entire livelihood because medieval law couldn't grasp the concept that women might actually be good at running businesses. But wait, it gets better. Women could be convicted of crimes, but they couldn't defend themselves in court. They needed a male relative to speak for them, because obviously a woman couldn't possibly explain her own actions better than some uncle who wasn't even there. Records show that in one town, a woman was accused of stealing bread. Her defense was that she'd actually bought it and had witnesses to prove it. But since her husband was away and her brother was too busy to come to court, she was found guilty by default. The fine? Working in the accuser's bakery for free for 6 months, medieval justice at its finest. The punishment system was equally ridiculous. Men who committed crimes could often buy their way out with fines. Women? Not so much. They faced public humiliation, like being dunked in rivers or forced to wear signs listing their crimes. One court record from 1374 shows a woman was forced to walk through town wearing a sign that said, "I dared to argue with my husband about cheese." The real crime here was clearly the husband's inability to handle dairy-related criticism. Another woman had to stand in the town square for 3 hours holding a sheep because she'd suggested her husband's wool prices were too high. Inheritance laws were another masterpiece of unfairness. The basic rule was simple. Men got everything. A daughter could be the oldest, smartest, and most capable child, but if she had a baby brother, tough luck. All the family property would go to him, even if he was too young to tell the difference between a castle and a sandcastle. The most infuriating is when women did try to fight back legally, they were often accused of being troublemakers or witches. There's a reason why medieval court records show more women accused of witchcraft than any other crime. It was the medieval equivalent of calling the manager, except instead of getting a refund, you might get burned at the stake. Records show that women who brought multiple cases to court were 3 times more likely to face witchcraft accusations than those who stayed quiet. You wouldn't believe how the medieval economy was rigged to keep women poor and dependent. When it came to earning a living, medieval women faced more obstacles than a badly designed obstacle course. Let's talk about what medieval women actually did all day. Their daily lives were incredibly busy. Imagine juggling a dozen different jobs while following strict social rules and somehow making it all work. And work they did in ways that many history books tend to overlook. First up, jobs. Forget what you've heard about women just staying home and embroidering pillows. Medieval women were major players in many industries, especially brewing beer. That's right, until the 1500s, most beer brewers were women, called alewives. One town's records from 1375 show that 78% of licensed brewers were women. They were known for their careful attention to detail, particularly in keeping their equipment clean, which often resulted in better quality beer. Farming was another huge part of women's lives. Everyone in medieval families had to pitch in to make the farm work, and women played a crucial role. They planted crops, raised animals, and managed daily farm operations alongside their other duties. Records from one English village show women doing 70% of the field work while also handling household management. One fascinating record mentions a woman who managed to harvest an entire field while simultaneously breastfeeding twins and supervising 3 toddlers. Now that's multitasking. Speaking of households, let's talk about kids. The average medieval woman had around 5 to 7 children, if she survived having them. But here's the interesting part. They were often raising way more than that. With high death rates, many women ended up taking in orphaned relatives, stepchildren, or apprentices. One household record from 1389 shows a woman raising 12 kids, 3 of her own, 4 stepchildren, 2 orphaned nieces, and 3 apprentices. She apparently kept track of everyone by assigning them different colored threads to wear. Medieval version of name tags. Women found creative ways to manage these large households. They'd create informal childcare networks, taking turns watching each other's kids while others worked. One village actually had a system where women would rotate baby feeding duties, medieval daycare complete with built-in lunch service. They even developed a complex schedule system using notches on sticks since most couldn't write, prehistoric project management at its finest. Their career options were surprisingly varied. Women ran markets, worked as healers, and even participated in construction. Yes, construction. Records show women working as carpenters, plasterers, and even helping build cathedrals. One woman in York became so renowned for her stonework that she trained several apprentices, both male and female, in her techniques. The textile industry was another area where women excelled. Spinning, weaving, and making clothes were serious business ventures, not just household chores. A skilled spinner could earn enough to support her family, and many women became successful cloth merchants. The intricacy of the work required patience and skill, and many women passed these specialized techniques down through generations. Perhaps the most impressive aspect was how women created their own economic networks. They'd trade services, share resources, and help each other out in ways that often didn't involve money at all. Need childcare? Trade some eggs. Want someone to teach your daughter to read? Exchange some wool. One record mentions a woman paying for her son's education by teaching the teacher's wife how to make cheese. These informal economies helped communities thrive and showed impressive business savvy. Here's a fascinating statistic. In one French town, records show that women were involved in over 200 different types of work. They were bakers, butchers, candle makers, rope makers, and more. While they often had to work within the social constraints of their time, they found ways to pursue various careers and contribute to their community's economic life. Life certainly wasn't easy. Between managing households, raising children, and handling various jobs, medieval women had their hands full. But they created strong support networks and developed efficient systems to get everything done. Church gatherings, for instance, became opportunities to exchange news, share tips, and arrange trades. combining social, spiritual, and practical needs in one setting. The day-to-day reality for medieval women was complex. While they faced many restrictions, they also found ways to be productive members of society and often gained respect in their communities through their skills and hard work. Records show numerous cases of women being praised for their business acumen, healing abilities, or craft skills. Medieval women developed a remarkable set of skills out of necessity. Many could brew beer, deliver babies, manage farms, run businesses, and raise large families, sometimes all at once. They were experts at finding practical solutions to daily challenges and making the most of their opportunities. And that's really what defined medieval women's lives: practicality, resourcefulness, and the ability to make things work despite challenges. For every illuminated manuscript showing a woman in quiet contemplation, there were countless others out there actively participating in medieval economic and social life, finding ways to thrive within the structure of their society. These women weren't just surviving, they were often the backbone of medieval communities, contributing their skills, knowledge, and labor to keep society running smoothly. But the economy wasn't really in their favor. The economy was like a rigged game of Monopoly where women weren't even allowed to roll the dice. Want to start a business? Sorry, you need a man's permission. Want to keep your earnings? Nope, that belongs to your husband now. Want to inherit property? Better hope you've got a time machine to take you to the 21st century. The whole system was designed to keep women's purses as empty as a medieval lord's promises. Let's break down the numbers, because they're wild. Records from a 1378 English town show that women were paid exactly half what men earned for identical work. Half. And this wasn't some unwritten rule. It was actually written into guild regulations. One document literally states, "A woman's work, being naturally inferior, shall be compensated at half the rate of a man's." The only exception, if the woman could prove she was better at the job than any available man. The catch? She had to prove it to a panel of men who'd lose money if they admitted she was better. Talk about a conflict of interest. It's like asking turkeys to vote for Thanksgiving. The tax system was another masterpiece of medieval unfairness. Women-owned businesses were taxed at higher rates because, get this, they were considered unusual and therefore suspicious. A female baker in York had to pay 3 times the tax of her male competitor, even though her bread won every local competition. Her response? She started selling her bread through her 10-year-old son. Suddenly, the tax dropped to normal rates because apparently a child was more trustworthy than a skilled adult woman. The tax records actually list her business as John's Bread, even though little John could barely reach the oven. Guild regulations were particularly creative in keeping women down. Most guilds flat out banned women from joining. The few that allowed them had special female member rules. The Weavers' Guild of Paris required women to prove they could weave blindfolded while reciting the Lord's Prayer backward, a test they definitely didn't make men take. One clever woman actually managed it, so they added, while standing on one foot, to the requirements. Another guild required women to prove they had no living male relatives within 100 miles who could do the job instead. Medieval workplace discrimination was nothing if not thorough. The property game was even worse. Women technically could own land, but good luck keeping it. Records from 1365 show a woman inherited a farm from her aunt, only to have the local lord declare it improper for a woman to own so much land. His solution? He'd help manage it for her. And by help, he meant take all the profits while leaving her with all the work. It's like having a business partner who takes your money but makes you do their taxes. She ended up having to marry her farmhand just to keep a small portion of her own property. Banking was another joy. Women couldn't take out loans without a male guarantor, but they were fully responsible for their husband's debts. One poor woman in 1392 had to pay off her husband's gambling debts by selling her prized cow collection. Yes, medieval people collected cows. They were like the Beanie Babies of their time. When she finally paid everything off, her husband celebrated by taking out another loan. The court records show she eventually solved this problem by telling every moneylender in town that her husband was actually her mentally confused uncle. Medieval problems require medieval solutions. The workplace itself was a maze of restrictions. Women couldn't work after sunset because it was improper. They couldn't work too close to men because it was distracting. They couldn't earn too much because it would upset the natural order. One successful female merchant in Florence had to pretend all her business decisions came from her cat, because apparently a cat was more credible than a woman. The best part? The cat signed documents with its paw print and nobody questioned it. The cat, by the way, had a better credit rating than most men in the city. Despite all these restrictions, some medieval records show women running successful underground businesses. They created secret trading networks, used code names, and sometimes disguised themselves as men. One group of female traders in Venice used a complicated system involving laundry on clotheslines to signal market prices to each other. When the authorities finally caught on, they couldn't do anything about it because technically there was no law against suspicious laundry arrangements. One official reportedly complained, "They're turning honest washing into dishonest commerce." The most absurd was how they justified all this economic discrimination. Women couldn't handle money because they were too emotional, yet records show male merchants regularly got into sword fights over minor price disagreements. Women were too weak to run businesses, yet they were somehow strong enough to do backbreaking farm work. Women were too simple to understand finances, yet they were often the ones keeping their households from going bankrupt while their husbands bought yet another unnecessary sword. One account shows a wife carefully managing her family's finances for 20 years while her husband invested their savings in a foolproof plan to find mermaids. But you know what happens when you tell someone they can't do something for long enough? They get really, really clever at finding ways around the rules. And medieval women? They turned outsmarting the system into an art form. Being clever wasn't just a bonus for medieval women, it was a survival skill. When men create every rule in the book, you either learn to read between the lines or get crushed by them. And medieval women, they got so good at finding loopholes, they could have taught modern lawyers a thing or two. Medieval records are full of women who turned oppression into opportunity, usually while the men were too busy congratulating themselves to notice. Take education, for example. Girls weren't supposed to learn to read because it might give them dangerous ideas. But noble women needed to manage household accounts, so they convinced everyone that learning numbers wasn't really reading. One clever noblewoman taught her entire household to read by claiming she was just teaching them to count prayer beads. By the time anyone caught on, her servants were better educated than most priests. She even started a trend of prayer counting classes that spread through 3 counties before the church realized they'd accidentally created an underground literacy network. The business world saw some particularly creative solutions. Since women couldn't officially run shops, they became really good at running them unofficially. Records from 1367 show a man's business that was mysteriously only open when his wife was there. The husband spent most of his time napping in the back room while his wife did all the work. But hey, technically, it was his shop. When customers asked why he never seemed to know anything about his own business, he'd say he was practicing delegation. Medieval management at its finest. The wife eventually started charging people extra to wake him up for questions, creating medieval Europe's first consulting fee. Some women got even more creative with their workarounds. One genius in the 14th century London ran her entire merchant empire through a network of cats. Yes, cats. She trained them to follow specific trade routes, carrying messages hidden in their collars. The local guards never thought to check the cats, because who would suspect a cat of running an international trading network? When she was finally caught, the court records show more confusion than anger. One judge actually asked if the cat should be put on trial too. She got off with a warning because nobody could figure out how to write illegal feline commerce in Latin. The whole women are too emotional thing backfired beautifully sometimes. Since everyone expected women to be dramatic, they could get away with outrageous behavior that would have landed men in serious trouble. Records show a woman avoided paying taxes by bursting into tears and wailing about her poor little chickens whenever the tax collector came around. He was so uncomfortable with female emotions that he'd leave without collecting. She kept this up for 12 years. Her poor little chickens probably owned half the town by then. The best part? She didn't even own chickens. Speaking of playing the emotion card, some women turned the whole hysteria diagnosis into a superpower. Can't attend a boring social event? Hysteria. Don't want to marry that creepy old lord? Hysteria. Need a day off from pretending to be bad at everything? You guessed it, hysteria. One noblewoman reportedly avoided an arranged marriage by developing a mysterious ailment that made her speak in riddles whenever her unwanted suitor was around. Miraculously, she recovered completely when he married someone else. Her family physician noted that it was the most convenient case of hysteria he'd ever seen. The really smart ones used men's egos against them. They'd praise their husbands for brilliant ideas that were actually their own, run entire estates while pretending to just help a little, and solve major problems while making men think they'd figured it out themselves. A woman in 1382 fixed her town's entire water supply system, but convinced everyone it was her intellectually challenged brother's idea. Because they'd rather believe a man was secretly a genius than admit a woman knew about engineering. She later used the same technique to redesign the town's defensive walls, cure a cattle plague, and invent a new type of plow, all credited to various male relatives who could barely dress themselves. The statistics are pretty telling. In towns where women weren't allowed to own property, there's a suspicious number of businesses owned by sickly men who needed their wives to handle everything. In one French village, 60% of the male business owners were reportedly too delicate to handle their own affairs. Either medieval men were remarkably fragile, or medieval women were remarkably good at working the system. One town's records show an epidemic of masculine frailty that mysteriously affected only men whose wives were good at mathematics. But perhaps the most impressive feat was how they passed these skills down through generations. Mothers taught daughters the art of playing dumb while being smart, of following rules while breaking them, and of smiling sweetly while running circles around the men who underestimated them. One book of household tips from 1375 is actually a coded manual for getting around male authority. Its recipe for sweet bread is really instructions for hiding money from your husband. The section on proper flower arrangement contains detailed instructions for running a secret business. Even the embroidery patterns were actually maps showing safe routes for women travelers. All this mental gymnastics had an interesting side effect. Medieval women got really good at reading people and situations. When you have to outsmart half the population just to get through your day, you develop some serious skills. Some historians argue that medieval women invented psychology, not because they were naturally more emotional, but because they had to become experts at managing male egos just to survive. Speaking of marriage, you wouldn't believe the creative ways women found to handle being legally considered their husband's property. Let's just say that being someone's property works a lot better when that someone doesn't know what they actually own. Marriage in medieval times was about as romantic as a business contract, because that's exactly what it was. Your father would basically sell you to the highest bidder, and boom, you're someone's wife. But there was one escape route that many women secretly hoped for: becoming a widow. Sure, it wasn't exactly a fun way to gain freedom, but when your options are be property or be free, you work with what you've got. And oh boy, did medieval women work that system like pros. The numbers tell a fascinating story. In one English town in 1385, records show that widows owned 40% of all businesses, despite making up only 15% of the population. Meanwhile, married women owned exactly 0 businesses, because legally they couldn't own anything. One widow actually bought her late husband's business at auction, the same business she'd been running for him for 20 years while he spent their money on hunting dogs. The court records note that she paid for it with money she'd secretly saved while pretending her husband's pants needed constant expensive repairs. Widows had powers that married women could only dream about. They could own property, run businesses, make contracts, and, here's the kicker, refuse to remarry. That last one was huge. Records show some younger widows practically racing to set up their businesses before their families could marry them off again. One clever widow in France started a mourning accessories business because nobody would pressure a professional mourner to remarry. That would just be tasteless. She became so successful that other widows started copying her idea, creating what historians call the medieval widow fashion industry. The freedom was so desirable that some women got creative about achieving widow status. There's this fantastic court record from 1392 where a woman convinced her elderly husband to become a monk. He got to spend his final years in peaceful prayer. She got her independence, and everyone pretended it was all very holy and not at all a clever divorce scheme. Medieval problems require medieval solutions. Another woman convinced her husband that managing their business was damaging his masculine dignity, so he nobly handed her all control and spent his days writing poetry about how busy he was. But here's where it gets really interesting. Widows formed their own support networks. They'd help each other set up businesses, share legal advice, and warn each other about men looking for wealthy widow marriages. In some towns, they even had secret signals. Wearing your belt a certain way meant, "I'm not interested in remarrying. Stop asking." One group of widows in Italy started a fake curse rumor that marrying a widow would give you bad luck. It worked so well that local men started crossing the street to avoid them. The widows reportedly found this hilarious and would sometimes walk in groups just to watch entire streets of men suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. The church wasn't too happy about all these independent women running around. They kept preaching about how widows should live quiet lives of prayer and definitely not become successful business owners. But what could they do? Even they had to admit that forcing widows to remarry wasn't very Christian. One frustrated priest wrote that widows are becoming altogether too merry in their mourning. Translation: these women are enjoying their freedom way too much. Some widows would donate just enough to the church to keep the priests quiet while spending the rest on expanding their businesses. Rich widows were particularly powerful. Without a husband to legally control their wealth, they could do pretty much whatever they wanted. One widow in 1378 bought an entire village just because the local lord had been rude to her. Another funded a cathedral construction, but insisted that all the angel statues be female. The church couldn't exactly refuse. Money was money, even if it came from a suspiciously independent woman. She even had them add a small carved cat in the corner that looked suspiciously like her late husband's least favorite pet. Some widows got so good at the independence game that they started teaching other women their tricks. They'd hire married women to work in their shops, giving them a taste of economic freedom. They'd coincidentally need help managing their accounts just when a neighbor's daughter showed interest in learning math. One widow ran what was officially a grief counseling group, but was actually a business strategy meeting for other women looking to gain independence. The local authorities finally caught on when they noticed that the grieving women were all leaving with suspicious amounts of business knowledge and accounting skills. Men kept trying to create laws to control widows, but it never quite worked. Make a law saying widows can't own taverns? They'd open dining rooms instead. Ban them from money lending? They'd create elaborate gift exchange systems. One widow responded to a law against women owning ships by registering her fleet in her dead husband's name. Because technically, the law didn't say anything about zombie ship owners. She even kept a portrait of him in her office, which she'd consult loudly about business decisions whenever officials visited. For many women, seeing their mothers or aunts transform from obedient wives into independent widows was their first glimpse of what freedom looked like. Young girls would secretly hope to marry someone old, while their parents thought they were being admirably self-sacrificing. Medieval marriage strategies could get pretty dark. There are actual records of girls praying for a kind husband who wouldn't live too long. Of course, not every widow had it great, but compared to being married, widowhood was often the medieval equivalent of winning the lottery. Unless, that is, someone decided you'd gained a bit too much independence and started whispering that word that struck fear into every medieval woman's heart. Calling someone a witch in medieval times wasn't like calling someone a witch today. It wasn't a joke about someone being cranky or having a black cat. Nope. It was basically the medieval version of delete her whole life. And guess what? The people most likely to be called witches were women who didn't fit into neat little boxes of what men thought they should be. The accusation was such a powerful weapon that just whispering the word witch could destroy a woman's entire life faster than you can say medieval justice. The statistics are mind-blowing. In one German town in 1387, every single woman accused of witchcraft had either refused marriage, inherited property, or knew how to read. Suspicious much, the town records showed that the local judge actually wrote, "The more independent the woman, the more likely she deals with the devil." Because obviously the only way a woman could support herself was through satanic book clubs. They even had a special tax on single women called the witch risk fee, basically charging women for the crime of not having a man to control them. Here's a real case that shows how ridiculous things got. A woman named Martha in 1391 was accused of witchcraft because her cows produced more milk than her neighbor's cows. The evidence against her? She talked to her cows kindly instead of hitting them, and she kept their barn clean. Revolutionary stuff, right? The court seriously argued that no woman could be that good at farming without demonic help. Martha's defense was amazing. She pointed out that if the devil was helping her, he was doing a terrible job since she still had to wake up at dawn to milk the cows herself. She also asked why Satan, with all his supposed powers, couldn't at least invent a better milking stool. The whole witch thing was really just a catch-all term for woman we don't like. Healer who knows which herbs cure fevers. Witch. Midwives with a high survival rate for births. Super witch. Woman who's better at business than the local merchants. Witch with a side of evil. One female brewer was accused of witchcraft because her beer was suspiciously good. The suspicious part? Her accusers were all male brewers who'd lost customers to her. The court records actually include a debate about whether making beer taste good was an act of sorcery. The evidence they used to prove witchcraft would be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic. Own a cat? Witch. Talk to yourself while working? Witch. Good at math? Definitely a witch. One woman was accused because she had unusually clean floors. Apparently, proper housekeeping was satanic. The judge's official ruling stated that no honest woman has time for such excessive cleanliness. Medieval men really said anything to avoid doing chores. Another woman was accused because she didn't get sick during a plague. Obviously, her good health was a sign of dark powers rather than basic hygiene. The witch hunters had some creative theories about how to spot a witch. They claimed witches couldn't cry, and had secret marks on their bodies, also known as birthmarks or freckles. One expert wrote that witches could be identified by their tendency to help others without asking for payment, because obviously only someone in league with the devil would be genuinely kind. He also claimed witches couldn't say the Lord's Prayer backward while hopping on one foot, which, let's be honest, is a challenge for anyone. Once accused, women faced a classic heads I win, tails you lose situation. Deny being a witch? That's exactly what a witch would do. Confess to being a witch? Well, there's your proof. Fight back against your accusers? Witchy behavior? Accept your fate quietly? Suspicious lack of protest? Must be a witch. One woman was accused of using witchcraft to make her husband love her because he defended her in court. The judge actually said, "No man would naturally support his wife without demonic influence." Smart women started taking preventive measures. They deliberately mess up their cooking sometimes or pretend they couldn't read. Some would intentionally keep one corner of their house dusty just to avoid looking too competent. A group of female merchants in France started a brilliant tradition of accidentally dropping things while counting money, just to appear bad at math. Their profits probably took a hit, but hey, better to look clumsy than end up in witch court. One clever woman even started a trend of tripping over her own feet regularly, just to appear less graceful. But the most infuriating part? The same men who accused women of being witches would secretly come to them for help. Got a toothache? Go to the witch who knows about herbs. Wife having a difficult pregnancy? Better call that evil midwife. Can't balance your accounts? Time to visit that suspicious widow who's good with numbers. Records show that one famous witch hunter regularly consulted a wise woman for his back pain while actively prosecuting other healers. When questioned about this hypocrisy, he claimed he was monitoring her for signs of wickedness for 15 years of back treatments. All these witch hunts had a chilling effect on women's independence that lasted for centuries. After all, who would want to stand out or show their skills if it meant risking everything? And speaking of lasting effects, you wouldn't believe how many of these medieval ideas about controlling women snuck their way into modern times. Sure, those medieval rules about women are ancient history, just like your great-aunt's fashion choices, right? Wrong. Many of those old ideas stuck around longer than that weird Jell-O salad recipe from the 1950s, and some of them are still causing trouble today, like that one relative who keeps bringing up politics at Thanksgiving dinner. Let's do some time traveling. Women couldn't own property in medieval times, and guess what? In some parts of America, women couldn't get credit cards without their husband's permission until 1974. That's right. Your grandma might have had an easier time buying a castle in 1374 than getting a MasterCard in 1974. At least medieval women could pay for things with chickens. The workplace is another goldmine of leftover medieval thinking. Remember how medieval guilds made special rules to keep women out of certain jobs? Fast forward to 1973, when women still couldn't be airline pilots in most countries. The reason? Women are too emotional to fly planes. Because apparently, men never lose their cool, except when their favorite sports team loses, or someone takes their parking spot, or their sandwich has the wrong kind of mustard. The education gap is particularly wild. Medieval folks thought women's brains would explode if they learned too much. While we're not quite that dramatic anymore, until the 1970s, many top universities wouldn't admit women because it might distract the male students. As if guys needed help getting distracted, they were doing just fine on their own, thank you very much. The gender pay gap has medieval roots too. Back then, women were paid half what men earned because their work was considered naturally inferior. Today, women still earn less on average, though now we use fancier words to justify it. Instead of saying women's work is worth less, we say things like market forces and career choices. Same old medieval sandwich, just with different bread. Even modern marriage laws have some medieval DNA. Until surprisingly recently, husbands couldn't legally rape their wives in many countries, because, like in medieval times, wives were considered property. This didn't change in all U.S. states until 1993. That means there are people younger than some pairs of genes who were born before women had full legal protection from their husbands. What's sneaky is how these old ideas keep popping up in new disguises, like when companies say they can't promote women to leadership roles because they might get pregnant and leave. It's just a modern version of medieval guilds saying women couldn't be master craftsmen because they might get married and move away. The excuses got fancier, but the song remains the same. But here's the good news. Just like medieval women found ways to bend those rigid rules, modern women keep pushing back against these outdated ideas. Every time someone says, women can't do that, another woman goes ahead and does it anyway, and usually does it better, just to make a point. The lesson from all this medieval madness? Progress isn't a straight line. It's more like trying to walk home after too much mead. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, occasional falling into a ditch, but eventually getting where you need to go. So the next time someone says, that's just the way things are, remember, they probably said the same thing in 1386. And those medieval women would probably look at us now and say, not bad, but you've still got work to do.